Today, I will be presenting a series of 3 papers. The papers are as follows. The first is Risk Preferences, Time Preferences, and Smoking Behavior by Glenn W. Harrison, Andre Hofmeyr, Don Ross, and J. Todd Swarthout. The second is Staying Ahead and Getting Even. Risk Preferences of Profitable Poker Players by David Eli and Jaimie Lien. The third is Attitudes Toward Risk. Experimental Measurement in Rural India by Hans P. Binswanger. Each paper is in some way related to my group's final project, a research paper in which we are comparing observations of risk-taking behavior in games of simplified blackjack with health-related decisions. The aim of this presentation is to provide several unique perspectives that are at the same time related to my group's final project, therefore providing greater clarity regarding our research and our findings. Each paper covered in this presentation will ideally provide a unique insight that allows for a greater understanding of my group's final project. Therefore, each paper will be explored in a different section of the presentation and will be tied back to our group's own project.
Before I continue with the analysis of the 3 papers that this presentation will focus on, I will first provide some background information on our group project. Our project seeks to answer the question, do individuals weigh risk decisions similarly when their choices impact different aspects of their lives? To answer this question, we decided to look specifically at the case study of health decisions. We asked, do people who take precautions in casino games also take precautions when it comes to their health? We set about using the classic casino game, blackjack, to help us collect data on patterns in risk behavior, subsequently correlating these results with risk attitudes regarding health. To put simply, as a player in the game of blackjack, the aim is to maximize the numbers shown on your cards while not exceeding a set threshold. In our version of simplified blackjack, the threshold was 11. Hence, players make decisions regarding how much money they want to bet, as well as whether or not they see the value of taking on the risk of asking for an additional card. By running experiments of simplified blackjack games, our experimental goal was to observe participants' risk preferences and derive an understanding of their general levels of risk aversions when they are put under a specific blackjack game setting. The results of our blackjack games would then be compared with patterns of risk behavior demonstrated by our blackjack games participants, measured with a survey that focused on questions regarding drinking habits and driving experiences. The aim of this study was to find out if participants showed similar levels of risk aversion when it came to both their decisions in blackjack and their decisions in health-related matters. For example, it could be argued that an individual who is more risk-averse while playing blackjack is equally more risk-averse when making health-related decisions that affect their health. Our findings can then be used to analyze risk behavior in the real world.
Now that we have a basic understanding of the group project's goals and methodology, we can move on to analyzing the other papers and make inferences that may help to provide more insight into our own study and experimentation process. The first paper I'm going to look at is Risk Preferences, Time Preferences, and Smoking Behavior by Glenn W. Harrison, Andre Hofmeyr, Don Ross, and J. Todd Swarthout, published in February of 2018. Risk Preferences, Time Preferences, and Smoking Behavior by Harrison et al. Conducts a risk and time preference experiment on a group of smokers, who are the subjects of the experiment. By doing so, they look to explore the relationship between risk preferences, time preferences, and addiction, using smoking as an independent variable to measure addiction. Smoking was chosen because it is known to be one of the primary behavioral risk factors for the additional utilization of health resources and expenditures on health. The costs of smoking are very apparent, and smoking involves a trade-off between the short-term benefits of smoking and the long-term costs. Their experiment was conducted in a laboratory setting. To measure the dependent variable of smoking addiction, the authors used the Fagerstrom test for nicotine dependence, which, according to Heatherton et al. 1991, is an accurate measure of smoking severity. Moving on to the independent variables. To measure risk preference, they used the tried and tested lottery task that was based on Hay and Orr, 1994. And to measure time preference, subjects were presented with a task based on Kohler and Williams, 1999, that separated monetary rewards based on the time that subjects would receive the amount of money they chose. Interestingly, they found that there were no differences in the risk preferences of smokers and non-smokers. This meant that there is no relationship between smoking and risk preference. In other words, someone who smokes more is not necessarily more or less risk averse. However, the study found that time preferences were significantly different between smokers and non-smokers. Specifically, smokers discount significantly more than non-smokers. They found that smoking intensity actually exponentially increases the likelihood of discounting, causing heavier smokers to become more resistant to treatment. In other words, smokers who have higher time preferences and smoke more heavily will find it harder to quit smoking based on their discount rates. This paper was seminal because it estimated risk and time preferences as a function of observable characteristics instead of as their own parameters. According to the study, there is a positive relationship between smoking and greater discounting behavior. For every additional cigarette smoker per day, there is a 2 percentage point increase in the likelihood of discounting. It was also found that smoking intensity is linked to the likelihood of making time-inconsistent choices. It is important to note that the direction of causality is not proven in this paper. Causality can run in both directions. This study, similar to our own group project, also aimed to test for risk preferences. However, this paper is unique as it looks to focus on exploring the effects of addiction, subsequently finding a connection between addiction and time preference. While in our own project, we attempted to look at the correlation between blackjack results and health-related risk behavior, we did not model either as a function of observable traits. This study actually revealed certain questions about our own group project. Firstly, this paper makes an important distinction between risk preference and time preference. Oftentimes, the two things are confounded. However, in this project, the distinction is made very clear, especially since the separate variables are found with separate methodologies. While our group project seeks to measure risk is accurately explored through the blackjack games, but less so through the health-related questions. This means that it could be argued that the health-related questions of our own study are actually more of a measure of time preference, as the results from certain health decisions can potentially take effect in years or even decades to come. Furthermore, the paper by Harrison et al. Shows that an important thing to take into account is the direction of causality. From our blackjack and health study, we cannot tell if risk behavior affects health decisions or if health decisions affect blackjack results, if there is any relation at all. Altogether, the paper by Harrison et al. On smoking and risk and time preferences helps to provide a valuable insight into a similar method of experimentation in which two different methods of measuring behavior is explored and analyzed. Knowing how such a method of experimentation can be done professionally and effectively, we as a group working on our own project will be able to create a stronger and more methodologically sound experiment.
The second paper I chose to look at for this presentation is Staying Ahead and Getting Even, Risk Preferences of Profitable Poker Players by David Eli and Jaimie Lien for the University of California, San Diego, published in November 8, 2010. The reason why I chose this article to explore is because I wanted to help our group gain a greater insight into the thought process behind card games and how experts in the field analyze risk preferences when it comes to card games. Thus, an article that specifically looked at risk preferences in the playing of poker seemed like the perfect example to look at. Staying Ahead and Getting Even, Risk Preferences of Profitable Poker Players by Eli and Lien aims to provide a function of recent changes in wealth by looking at the risk appetites of experienced poker players. This because a lot of existing research shows that risk preference is often a function of recent changes in wealth and not of total lifetime wealth. Predicted by prospect theory is a common pattern in which large gains and large losses decrease risk aversion, known as the break-even effect and the house money effect respectively, according to Taylor and Johnson, 1990. This study by Eli and Lien looks to test these results. seeking to find out if recent changes in wealth affect the risk appetites of poker players, and therefore showing if recent changes in wealth can affect risk aversion. This paper studied the behavior of experienced, successful online poker players. The independent variable was measured as the amount of money lost or gained by a player in a session of poker. The measurement of the dependent variable was achieved by looking at a player's decisions in two domains. First, the player's decision of how long to play were analyzed, assuming that if a player plays longer, they are less risk averse. Then, the less risk averse a player is, the more likely they will be to continue playing. Secondly, the player's decision to fold his hand or not was analyzed. This point of analysis is unique to poker. Folding gives a player a sure payoff of 0, as the player is no longer participating in the round of poker. However, if the player continues playing, they will be led into an uncertain payoff, positive or negative. It was found in this study that even though the amounts of money won or lost in a single sitting of poker are relatively small compared to one's lifetime wealth, such gains and losses still significantly affect risk preferences in an immediate setting. The paper found that decreased risk aversion is true for the break-even effect, but not for the house money effect. Players who have lost tend to play longer and less conservatively. These findings are consistent with the break-even effect. Losses make the player more risk-loving or more risk-averse. This was found when players running a loss actually kept playing for longer hours and folded less, likely in an effort to win their money back. On the other hand, players who are holding a profit actually behave more conservatively, stopping their sessions sooner and playing more conservatively at the table. This is contrary to the house money effect, which suggests that players would also be less risk-averse if their profits were high. Players who held profits were happy to call it quits earlier, therefore playing shorter hours and folding more often to avoid losing their profits. Additionally, recent gains and losses in a time frame of 10 minutes have disproportionate effects on behavior, suggesting that individuals can rapidly internalize gains and losses. This paper provided excellent insight into the potential thought process of a player playing a card game. While the paper by Lien and Eli focused on professional poker players and our own group study focused on amateur blackjack players, comparisons can still be made regarding risk appetites due to recent changes in wealth. The findings from this paper emphasize the need for our own group project to take into account recent gains and losses, as the factor of recent changes in wealth can actually have an impact on the risk aversion of players. Unfortunately for my group and I, this means that the findings from this paper actually weaken the strength of the experiment in our own project, as it introduces a control variable that is unaccounted for. In an attempt to counter these variables, the number of blackjack games each participant played was fixed, controlling the number of games the players played. However, the action of choosing to stand or to hit was still affected by the variable of changes in wealth of recent wins. For example, a player who has won several rounds and may be more risk averse, so as to not jeopardize their winning position. This suggests that in our experiment, rounds of blackjack were not independent.
The third and last paper I chose to look at is Attitude Toward Risk, Experimental Measurement in Rural India. This paper was written by Hans P. Binswanger and was written in 1980. This paper was chosen because it provided a historical perspective on the study of risk preferences. While the last paper highlighted the potential weaknesses of using a card game in measuring risk, this paper emphasized the strengths of using a gambling approach with real payoffs. Therefore, I believe that this paper could be very useful to my group, as it would provide insights into both the historical context of risk preference experimentation and the ability for gambling-related games to help in coming to conclusions regarding risk decisions. Interestingly, while the original aims of this paper were to gather information regarding the state of development and the agricultural situation in India, the paper ended up being a useful source of information on risk behavior. Furthermore, it is one of the first, if not the first paper that looked to test risk preferences in the field. At the time, all work on measuring attitudes toward risk were carried out in laboratory settings by experimental psychologists. Thus, this paper marked the foray of risk-related experimentation into both the field of economics and field experimentation. The aim of the paper was to determine if differences in behavior between farmers of different levels of wealth are a consequence of different attitudes toward risk, or instead possibly related to other constraints such as restricted access to financing and restricted access to modern inputs. To test for the relationship between wealth and risk preference, Binswanger carried out his research on 240 households using two methods. Firstly, an interview method eliciting certainty equivalence, and secondly, an experimental gambling approach with real payoffs. His research was conducted in a semi-arid tropical area of India, characterized by a high climatic risk for agriculture. In the case of this study, the independent variable was attitudes toward risk and the dependent variable was the wealth level of farmers. Many of the subjects were illiterate, so the experiment had to be kept as simple as possible for the illiterate individuals to understand. At the same time, the methodology of the experiment set a foundation for the modern-day risk experiment, establishing reasonable boundaries for rewards and incentives that would allow for the most accurate results while still being reasonable enough for our subject to participate. The method of the gambling portion of the experiment is as follows. Participants pick from a series of choices that range from a low payoff to a high payoff, depending on whether a coin is flipped heads or tails. An individual who chose the most risk-averse option would gain the same amount either way of 50 rupees. An individual who chose the least risk-averse option would gain 0 rupees if the coin landed on heads and 200 rupees if the coin landed on tails. The incentives were true because the monetary amounts being given to the participants were larger than monthly incomes in India at the time. Meanwhile, the methodology for the interview portion of the experiment, following Dillon and Scandizzo, is as follows. A farmer's risk attitudes were appraised via the choices between hypothetical but realistic farm alternatives, involving risky versus sure outcomes. These choices were given in an interview setting. The issue with this method was that, when performed, it resulted in massive differences in coefficients of risk aversion due to severe interviewer bias. It was found that the interview method was not very robust and was therefore not a good indicator of risk preference. However, using the gambling experiment, correlations were made between risk aversion and personal characteristics, regardless of the causal nature of the relationship. It was found that at a very low payoff level, risk aversion is widely distributed from intermediate levels to neutral levels. It was also found that once payoff levels reach the neighborhood of monthly labor incomes, risk aversion is highly concentrated at intermediate and moderate levels. The study then found that at higher payoff levels, wealth has little influence on risk aversion, although the effect appears to exist at lower payoff levels. The findings of the study imply that as the payoffs increase, individuals are shown to be more risk averse. It is important to note that with this experiment, losses were not possible in the experiment. This might result in less loss aversion, and players have less to lose. The author believes that the findings from this study can be extrapolated to policymaking for farming communities. It is suggested that differences in risk preference among farmers with similar economic situations would be explained by differences in other constraints, such as access to credit or marketing. Policy for farmers should therefore be geared towards removing such constraints instead of aiming to eliminate risk. Linking this paper back to our group project, we can see that there is a lot to consider when it comes to developing experiments to measure risk preference. One issue with the paper by Binswanger is that causality is not tested for. It is assumed in the beginning that wealth level is a consequence of risk preference, but in actuality it could be the other way around, where total level of wealth is what affects risk preference. While this paper documents one of the earliest forms of risk preference experimentation and may be rough on the edges, it provided the foundation for what a risk experiment should be like in terms of its structure, from the rewards to the controls. This helps us to understand how to develop our own experiment to measure risk, as well as knowing what aspects to prioritize in order to enhance the precision of an experiment. In particular, rewards should be chosen correctly to provide for a true incentive. At the same time, an element of risk must be true as well to ensure that players have a risk to be fearful of, therefore allowing for a true display of risk preference in the experiment. In conclusion, the three papers provide excellent insight into how to frame and develop risk experiments. The first paper by Harrison et al. Helped to highlight the difference between time preference and risk preference, and also showed the importance of knowing the difference between correlation and causation. The second paper by Eli and Lien raises awareness for the pitfalls of card experiments when being used to measure risk preference, suggesting that rounds of card games may not necessarily be independent. Lastly, the paper by Binswanger gave a foundation for how risk experiments should be structured. Firstly, by ensuring that the experiment is driven by true incentives, and secondly, by ensuring that players are wary enough of risks involved, that their behavior is a true display of risk preference.